He built a criminal empire with his bare hands, only to lose the use of his legs to a car bomb meant to kill him in a parking garage on a Tuesday afternoon. Bitter, isolated, and drowning in painkillers he refused to admit he needed, he fired every professional nurse the agency sent within a week. Some lasted 3 days. One lasted 4 hours. Then came a girl who couldn't even keep the lights on in her own apartment. She was 25, broke, raising a daughter alone, and she showed up to the interview 40 minutes late with baby formula stains on her sleeve. But she was the only one who looked at him and didn't flinch. She looked at him and saw a man who was drowning, and she jumped in anyway. Imani Carter's Corolla had 211,000 miles on it and a check engine light that had been on so long she'd started calling it the little orange friend. She parked it 3 blocks from the address because she didn't trust it to survive the hill, and she walked the rest of the way in flats that were falling apart at the seam, past houses that got bigger and whiter and more silent with every block, until she reached a wrought iron gate that looked like it belonged in front of a courthouse instead of a home. She checked the address twice. Then she checked it a 3rd time because her hands were shaking and she didn't trust her own eyes. This was it. This was the job. She pressed the buzzer at the gate and a voice, flat and unbothered, came through the little speaker. Name: Imani Carter. I'm here about the caregiver position. I know I'm late, I had to drop my daughter off and the sitter wasn't ready and come to the front door. The gate clicked and swung open on its own, slow and heavy, and Imani stood there for a second just staring at the driveway. It curved up through manicured hedges toward a house that looked less like a home and more like something out of a magazine she'd flipped through at the grocery store checkout. The kind of magazine she never bought because $7 was $7 she didn't have. He thought about turning around. She thought about it seriously for almost a full 10 seconds. Standing there in the open gate with her one good blazer buttoned crooked because she dressed in the dark so she wouldn't wake Suri. Then she thought about the eviction notice folded up in her purse. He thought about the light bill. She thought about the way her daughter's sneakers were a half size too small and Imani had been pretending not to notice for 3 weeks because new shoes meant something else had to go without. She walked up the driveway. 2 men met her at the front door. Both of them wore suits that fit too well to be off the rack. Both of them had the kind of stillness in their shoulders that told Imani, even without knowing anything about anything, that these were not men who worked in an office. One of them, older, with a nose that had clearly been broken more than once, patted her down without asking permission, took her keys and set them on a side table and grunted, "This way." The house was cold. Not temperature cold, though it was that too, but cold in the way a place feels when nobody actually lives there, just exists there. Marble floors that echoed every step. Art on the walls that looked expensive and said nothing. Imani followed the man down a hallway that felt longer than her entire apartment building, until they reached a set of double doors at the end. "Last interview today," the man said. "Try not to get fired in the first 5 minutes like the last one." "How long did the last one last?" 90 seconds, he said and walked away. Imani stood outside those doors for a moment, smoothing down her blazer, running her tongue over her teeth, doing the thing her mother used to call, putting your face on straight. Then she pushed the door open without knocking because knocking felt like something a nervous person did and she needed, more than anything in this moment, to not look nervous. The room was enormous. A fireplace big enough to stand in. Bookshelves that reached the ceiling. And by the window, in a black motorized wheelchair, sat a man who did not turn around when she walked in. "You're late," he said. His voice was low, rough, the kind of voice that didn't need to get louder to make a point. "Traffic," Imani said, which was half true. The other half was that her daughter had cried when she left and Imani had gone back inside for one more hug because some things mattered more than being on time. "I don't tolerate excuses." "Then I guess it's a good thing I gave you a reason instead." He turned the chair around. Foley. Imani had prepared herself for a lot of things walking in here. She'd looked him up the night before, sitting on her second-hand couch with her phone brightness turned all the way down so she wouldn't wake Suri, reading about Marcus Kane, 38 years old. A name that made men in expensive suits go quiet in restaurants. A name attached to more rumors than facts, because the facts about men like him rarely made it into print. She'd prepared herself for menace. For danger. She had not prepared herself for how young he still looked underneath all of it. or for the way his jaw was set like a man clenching down on something too heavy to say out loud. His eyes swept over her. The blazer. The flats falling apart at the seam. The formula stain on her sleeve she hadn't managed to scrub all the way out. "You're not a registered nurse," he said. "I'm an LPN, licensed. I have 3 years of home health experience and I can lift more than I look like I can. The agency sent me 3 registered nurses this month. All 3 quit." "Then maybe you don't need someone with more letters after their name," Imani said. "Maybe you need someone who isn't scared of you." Something flickered behind his eyes. Not quite surprise. More like recalibration, like he was doing math on her that hadn't been on the page before. "You think you're not scared of me? I think I've got a 2-year-old at home who screams louder than you probably ever have, and a landlord who's threatened to change my locks twice this year," Imani said. "I think fear is a luxury I stopped being able to afford a long time ago, Mr. Kane." He was quiet for a moment. The only sound in the room was the low hum of the wheelchair's motor as it shifted his weight slightly, a small, involuntary adjustment. "Why do you need this job so badly?" he asked. "Don't lie to me. I'll know." Imani could have given him something polished. She'd practiced polished answers on the drive over, the kind that sound good in interviews, about passion for caregiving and wanting to make a difference. But something about the flatness in his voice, the way he was looking at her like he already knew every lie she was capable of telling, made her decide the truth was the only currency worth spending in this room. "I need this job because I have $400 to my name and rent is due in 9 days, she said. "I need this job because my daughter needs shoes that fit and I've been stretching a bag of rice for 2 weeks. "I need this job because the agency told me you pay triple what anybody else does, and I don't care how difficult you are, Mr. Kane, difficult doesn't scare me. Difficult is Tuesday." The room stayed silent for a long moment. Marcus Kane studied her the way she imagined he studied everything. Looking for the crack, the angle, the thing she wanted from him besides the money she just admitted to needing. "You'll live here," he said finally. 6 days a week. Sundays off. "I have a daughter. She's 2. I can't just. There's a guest wing. Bring her." He said it like it cost him nothing, though something in his face suggested it cost him something to offer it. "I don't care about a toddler in this house as long as she doesn't touch anything on the 2nd floor." Imani blinked. Of everything she had braced herself for walking into this house, an offer of kindness had not been on the list. "Why?" "Because I have had 4 caregivers in 4 months and I'm running out of patience for people who quit," Marcus said. "If you're going to walk out on me too, at least have the decency to do it because I gave you a reason, not because you were scared of a chair." Imani looked at him, really looked, and saw underneath the coldness something she recognized because she'd worn it herself for the last 2 years. A person who had built a wall so high that even they had forgotten what was on the other side of it. "I don't walk out on people," she said quietly. "Not for free anyway." The corner of his mouth did something that wasn't quite a smile. "We'll see." 2 weeks in, Imani had learned the rhythms of the house the way she'd once learned the rhythms of a colicky newborn. By trial, by failure, by paying close attention to the small signs before the big ones arrived. She'd learned that Marcus hated being asked if he needed help and would rather struggle for 10 extra minutes than admit weakness out loud. She'd learned that the muscle in his jaw ticked before a spasm hit, a warning sign none of the other nurses had apparently bothered to notice because none of them had stayed long enough to notice anything. She'd learned that he didn't sleep more than 4 hours most nights, that he kept a gun in a drawer she wasn't supposed to know about, and that underneath 3 locked doors on the far side of the estate there was a whole life he never spoke of and she knew better than to ask about. Zuri had settled into the guest wing like she'd been born to it, chasing the household cat, an unimpressed gray tabby named Bishop who belonged to no one in particular, down marble hallways in socked feet, leaving crayon drawings on the backs of important-looking documents that made Frankie, the broken-nosed man who ran security, laugh so hard the first time he found one that he'd had to sit down. Marcus had not laughed. Marcus had barely acknowledged the child existed for the first 10 days, moving through the house like she was furniture he was choosing to step around. Then on a Tuesday night everything changed. It started with the spasm. Imani had gotten used to them by now. The sudden clench in his jaw, the tremor that ran up through dead muscle that shouldn't have been able to feel anything but somehow cruelly still could. She was in his room within seconds of hearing the strangled sound he made, trying not to cry out, throwing the blanket back, pressing her weight down against the violent jerk of his leg the way the manual said to, the way 3 months of practice had taught her hands to do without needing her brain to catch up. "Breathe," she said low and steady. "It'll pass. It always passes." "Easy for you to say," he ground out through his teeth, sweat beading at his temple. "You're not the one." He cut himself off with a hiss of pain. "Talk to me. Distract yourself." "I don't want to talk." "Fine, then focus on the pain." "Great strategy, really working out for you." A broken, breathless laugh escaped him despite himself, and underneath her hands she felt the muscle finally begin to unclench. That was when the door creaked open. Zuri stood in the doorway in her footy pajamas, one small fist rubbing at her eye, looking between her mother and the man in the bed with the particular fearless curiosity of a child who had not yet learned that some rooms are supposed to be off-limits. "Mommy? Is the man okay?" Imani's whole body went rigid. This was exactly the kind of moment she'd been dreading, the moment where a 2-year-old wandered into the private, ugly human parts of Marcus Kane's suffering that he guarded so fiercely from every adult in his life. "Baby, go back to bed, I'll be there in." "It's okay," Marcus said. His voice had changed. Not soft exactly, Imani wasn't sure his voice knew how to be soft, but quieter. "Careful. I'm okay. My leg was just being difficult." Zuri padded further into the room, entirely unbothered by the wheelchair parked by the window, by the tension still radiating off her mother's shoulders, by the fact that this man ran an empire that made grown men afraid to say his name too loudly. She climbed up onto the edge of the mattress with the total confidence of a toddler who had never once considered that she might not be welcome somewhere. "My leg gets mad too sometimes," Zuri informed him solemnly. "When I sleep on it wrong. Mommy rubs it and sings the song." Marcus stared at the small child now sitting cross-legged near his hip like she belonged there. Imani watched something cross his face that she didn't have a name for yet, something that looked almost like fear, though not the kind she was used to seeing in this house. "What song?" he asked, and his voice cracked on the second word in a way that had nothing to do with pain medication or nerve damage. Zuri, without waiting for permission, without any sense that this was strange, began to hum something tuneless and off-key, patting his blanket-covered knee with her small hand in a rhythm that made no sense but that she clearly believed contained real medicine. Imani opened her mouth to apologize, to scoop her daughter up, to smooth over whatever boundary had just been crossed, and then she saw his face. Marcus Kane, feared by men who killed for a living, who had not cried once in front of another human being since the explosion that took his legs, had his eyes closed and his jaw locked tight, and one single tear had escaped down the side of his face before he could stop it. Imani didn't say anything. She reached over and gently guided her daughter off the bed, whispering that it was time to go back to sleep. And Zuri went without protest, already yawning, already forgetting the whole encounter the way small children forget most things. At the door, Imani paused and looked back. "You didn't have to let her stay," she said quietly. "I know," Marcus said. His voice had gone rough again, guarded again, but something underneath it had shifted and they both knew it. "Turn off the light on your way out." She did. And that night, for the first time since she'd started working in that house, she heard him fall asleep without the television murmuring in the background to drown out his own thoughts. 3 weeks later, the syndicate business found its way through the front door in a way Imani had been half expecting and fully dreading. She was scraping burnt eggs out of a pan in the kitchen. Cooking had never been her gift, and Marcus's chef had quit 2 weeks before Imani arrived, another casualty of a household in turmoil, when Frankie appeared in the doorway looking like a man who'd swallowed something sharp. "Boss wants you in the study." "It's not medication time." "Yeah, well, the meeting in there ain't going good and he asked for you specifically." "Come on." The study, when she reached it, was thick with cigar smoke and a tension so heavy Imani could feel it pressing against her chest before she even fully stepped inside. 3 men sat across from Marcus's desk. She recognized one of them from a photograph she'd glimpsed once, carelessly left on the nightstand. A man named Deshawn, a lieutenant in Marcus's organization who Imani had heard Frankie describe in a low voice as hungry for something that ain't his. Deshaun was broad, heavy through the shoulders, with a scar cutting through one eyebrow that gave his whole face a permanently skeptical expression. He turned when Imani entered, his mouth curling into something unkind. "This a joke?" Deshaun said. "We're talking about the docs and you call in the nursemaid." Marcus didn't so much as glance at him. His eyes found Imani's and something passed between them. A silent instruction, quick and precise. "Play along." "My leg's cramping," Marcus said smoothly. "Imani, my stretches." Imani understood in an instant. He hated physical therapy. He avoided it every chance he got. This was not about his leg. "Sorry I'm late," she said, crossing the room, feeling the hostile eyes of 3 grown men track every step. "The stove was giving me problems." "We are in the middle of business, Marcus," Deshaun said, voice climbing. "The Reyes crew thinks you're soft. They think because you're stuck in that chair, this whole operation is ready to fall like fruit off a dead branch." "The street talks a lot of nonsense, Deshaun," Marcus said, his tone bored, almost lazy, which Imani had already learned meant the opposite of what it sounded like. "I run this from the neck up. My legs were never doing the thinking." "With respect," one of the other men muttered, "respect requires a show of strength. You haven't left this compound in 6 months." Imani knelt beside the wheelchair, unlatching the footrest with hands that were steadier than she felt, lifting his dead-weight leg into her lap the way she'd done 100 times by now. The room's silence pressed down on her like a physical thing. "You doubt my ability to lead," Marcus said, still calm, still terrifyingly composed. "We're saying maybe it's time to step back," Deshaun pushed. "Let someone else handle things day to day. Someone who can still stand next to the men." Imani felt the muscle under her hands twitch. Not a spasm this time, but something else. A suppressed, violent urge with nowhere to go because Marcus was anchored to that chair and could not do what every part of his body was screaming at him to do. She thought about the eviction notice in her purse 3 months ago. She thought about how many times in her life people had looked at her and decided, without asking, what she was and wasn't capable of. She thought about Marcus Kane crying over a 2-year-old humming a made-up song, and something in her chest cracked open with a fierce, protective heat she hadn't given herself permission to name yet. She stood up, dropped his leg back onto the footrest, maybe a touch harder than necessary. "Excuse me," she said, and her voice cut clean through the smoke-thick air. "Are you a doctor?" Deshaun blinked, thrown entirely off balance by the woman in scrub pants suddenly addressing him directly. "What? Are you a neurologist? A trauma surgeon? Because unless you have a medical degree hanging on a wall somewhere, I'd suggest you keep your opinions about Mr. Kane's physical condition to yourself. Little girl, you need to..." "No, you need to listen," Imani said, stepping around the desk, closing the distance between them until she was standing far too close for his comfort. A full foot shorter than him but carrying the unshakable confidence of a woman who had negotiated with utility companies threatening to cut her power off in the dead of winter. He survived an explosion that killed the 2 men standing closest to him. His spinal cord was severed. By every medical fact I know, he shouldn't have made it out of that ICU conscious, let alone dictating orders to his lawyers 4 days later. That man's pain threshold is higher than anything you've ever tested in your life, and he runs on maybe 4 hours of sleep because his own nervous system won't let him rest. He does not need to stand up to be in charge of this room. He could run this whole operation from a hospital bed with a straw in his mouth. Now you can sit down and talk about the docs like grown men, or you can leave because you are raising his blood pressure, and I do not have the patience today to deal with the consequences of that." The room went dead silent. Frankie, standing near the door, made a small strangled sound that might have been a laugh he was desperately trying to swallow. Deshaun's jaw worked. He looked at Imani, then at Marcus, then back at Imani, clearly recalculating something. Marcus smiled. It was cold, sharp, didn't reach his eyes, but it was a smile. "You heard the nurse," he said softly. "Sit down." Deshaun sat. The tension in the room didn't disappear, but it shifted, reshaped itself around a new understanding that had just been established without a single shot fired. Imani knelt back beside Marcus's chair, her hands shaking now that the adrenaline had nowhere left to go, and pretended to massage his calf just to have something to do with her fingers. Marcus's hand came to rest briefly lightly on the crown of her head. It lasted only a second. Felt like an anchor. "The South Docks are mine," Marcus said to the room, all authority again, the momentary vulnerability erased like it had never happened. "If the Reyes crew wants a war, they can have one. But we don't bleed in the streets. We cut their supply lines first." As the men fell back into line, Imani kept her eyes on the floor and her hands on his leg and understood with a cold clarity that she had just made herself a target in a room full of dangerous men. And she found to her own surprise that she wasn't sorry. The adrenaline crash caught up to Marcus 3 hours later in the shower, in a way that nearly broke something worse than his pride. Imani heard it before she saw it. A low curse, then the sickening thud of dead weight hitting tile. She dropped the laundry basket she'd been carrying and ran. He tried a solo transfer, something he usually managed through sheer stubborn upper body strength, but the meeting had drained him more than he'd admit, and his arms had given out halfway through. He lay half-collapsed against the tub, legs twisted beneath him at an angle that made Imani's stomach turn, water still running, steam thickening the air until it was hard to breathe. She shut off the water first. Then she knelt beside him. "Don't," Marcus rasped, eyes shut, jaw clenched so tight she worried about his teeth. "I don't need." "Left leg's pinned under you," she said, all business now, no room in her voice for anything but the task. "I'm going to straighten it. Tell me if the hip catches. Get Frankie. Frankie's dealing with the front gate. Besides, Frankie has the finesse of a moving truck. You want a dislocated hip, I'll call him. Otherwise, you're stuck with me." She didn't wait for permission this time. She wedged her hands under his knee, braced her weight and pulled his leg free of the tangle it had fallen into. He hissed through his teeth as dormant muscle was forced straight. "On 3 we're getting you to the bench. Use the grab bar. I take the weight below your waist. Understand?" He didn't answer, staring instead at the tile wall, the muscles in his neck rigid with a shame Imani understood better than he probably realized. To be hauled off a bathroom floor by a woman half his size was, for a man who had once made grown men go pale just by walking into a room, a specific kind of hell. "Desmond," she caught herself. "Marcus. Look at me." He didn't move. "Look at me," she said again, quieter this time, and something in her tone made him turn his head. "I'm not one of your capos," she said. "I don't care about your pride right now. I care about getting you off this cold floor before your body decides to punish you with another spasm. Grab the bar." He held her gaze a long moment. Then his hand shot up, closed around the steel bar bolted to the wall. 1, Imani counted, sliding her arms under his, locking her hands behind his back, feeling the heat of him through his soaked shirt. 2. She planted her feet on the wet tile. 3. He pulled with everything he had left and she hauled backward with everything she had, and together, clumsy and desperate, they got him onto the shower bench. Imani slid down the opposite wall, breathing hard, her scrubs soaked through with steam and sweat. Marcus sat with his forehead against his fist for a long moment. The silence stretched. "Why did you say that back there?" he finally asked. "In the study." "Say what?" "You mouthed off to a man who's put people in the ground for less than what you said to him. You painted a target on your own back." "Why?" Imani stared at the wet towel in her hands instead of answering right away. The honest answer felt too raw to hand over so easily. "Because you couldn't stand up and do it yourself," she said finally. "And if you tried and failed, they'd have smelled blood in the water. So I did it. You can't fire me for it. I already scrubbed the whole bathroom floor tonight anyway." Marcus lifted his head and looked at her. Really looked the way he had that first day in the study, except now there was nothing cold in it. "You're a liability, Imani." "I'm an asset," she corrected, standing and reaching for a dry towel. "I'm the only person in this house who isn't scared of you. That's rare. You should be paying me hazard pay." Something in his face shifted, not quite a smile but close enough. "Get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be worse." "It's always worse tomorrow," she said and walked out, and didn't let herself think too hard about the fact that her hands were still shaking, or that it wasn't entirely from the adrenaline anymore. It was 3 nights later, in the dark, in a moment neither of them had planned for, that Imani whispered the sentence that would end up changing both of their lives. Zuri had a fever. Not a dangerous one, not the kind that sends you sprinting to the emergency room with your heart in your throat, but the kind that makes a toddler cling and whimper and refuse to be put down, the kind that keeps a single mother up half the night with a cool washcloth and a low, worried hum in her chest that never fully goes away no matter how many times you've done this before. Imani had been up since 2 a.m., pacing the guest wing with Zuri's hot little body pressed against her shoulder, murmuring reassurances into her daughter's hair, when she heard footsteps she wasn't expecting, slow, uneven, the distinctive dragon catch of a man using a cane rather than the smooth hum of a motorized chair. She turned in the dim hallway light and found Marcus standing there. Standing on his own, leaning hard on the heavy silver-topped cane he almost never used because it exposed too much of what the injury had taken from him. His face was pale with the effort. He must have heard Zuri crying through the walls. The guest wing wasn't that far from his bedroom, and dragged himself up and out here in the middle of the night for reasons he probably couldn't have explained even to himself. "Is she okay?" he asked, voice rough with sleep and something else. "Fever," Imani said. "She'll be fine. This isn't your problem, you should be resting your—" "I have Tylenol in my bathroom. The infant kind. Frankie's wife left some when she visited last year." He said it awkwardly, like he wasn't sure why he was offering this information, like some part of him was embarrassed to have known it and kept it and remembered it existed. "You kept infant Tylenol in your house for a year?" "I don't throw things away," he said, which wasn't really an answer, and they both knew it. Imani looked at him standing there in the hallway at 2 a.m, sweat beading at his temple from the effort of walking on his own, holding himself upright through what she now understood was significant pain, just to check on a toddler who wasn't his and had no reason to matter to him at all. And that was when it slipped out of her, quiet, unguarded, the truest thing she'd said out loud in longer than she could remember, not meant for him to even fully hear, more a thought that escaped before she could catch it. "I think I might be falling for you and I have no idea what to do about that." She hadn't meant to say it. She would think about that moment for years afterward, the specific horror and relief of hearing her own voice say something she hadn't given herself permission to think, not fully, not in words, until it was already hanging in the air between them. Marcus went very still. For a long, agonizing second, Imani thought he hadn't heard her, that maybe the words had gotten lost in the low hallway light and the exhaustion pressing down on both of them. She almost let herself believe that. She almost turned away, ready to pretend the sentence had never left her mouth. Then he said quietly in a voice she'd never heard him use before, stripped of every wall he usually kept locked around it. "I heard you." Imani's whole body went hot with something between panic and relief. "Marcus, I didn't mean to, forget I said." "Don't," he said. "Don't take it back." Zuri stirred against her shoulder, whimpering, and Imani instinctively began the soft bouncing motion that had become second nature over the last 2 years. Marcus took a slow step closer, favoring his cane, until he was close enough that she could see the exhaustion carved into the lines of his face, and underneath it something rawer, something that looked almost like fear. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. "I haven't let anyone close enough to say something like that to me in years. I don't know what I'm supposed to say back." "You don't have to say anything back," Imani whispered. "I wasn't asking for anything. I was just, it slipped out. I'm tired and scared for my daughter, and apparently that's when the truth decides to come out of me." "Well," he said, and something in his voice cracked open, softened in a way that made her chest ache. "For what it's worth, I think I've been falling for a while too. I just didn't have the guts to say it before you did." Neither of them moved for a long moment. The hallway was quiet except for Zuri's small, congested breathing and the low hum of the air conditioning. Then Marcus reached out, slow, careful, like he was afraid she'd disappear if he moved too fast, and rested his hand against the side of Imani's face, his thumb brushing gently over her cheekbone. "Go get her some medicine," he said softly. "And then come find me. We should talk. Properly. Not at 2 a.m. in a hallway." "That sounds ominous." "It's not," he said. "I promise you, Imani, it's not." She believed him. God help her, she believed him completely. But the world Marcus Kane lived in did not make room for soft things, not for long, and the reckoning came exactly 9 days later. It started with a security breach nobody saw coming. Imani was sitting in the armchair in Marcus's bedroom, reading under a low lamp while he slept, finally deep and dreamless thanks to medication she'd bullied him into taking, when the bedside monitor that fed live footage from the perimeter cameras flickered once and went black. The hum of the air conditioning died a second later. The house dropped into a silence so total it felt like a held breath. Imani was on her feet before she'd consciously decided to move. She crossed to the door, pressed her ear against the wood and heard footsteps in the hallway. Heavy, deliberate, military precise. Nothing like Frankie's familiar uneven gait. She didn't scream. She didn't panic, not in the way that would have gotten either of them killed. She crossed back to the bed and clamped a hand over Marcus's mouth, shaking his shoulder hard enough to jolt him awake. His eyes snapped open, body already tensing to fight before he registered her face in the dim light. She pressed a finger to her lips and pointed at the dead monitor. Something cold and calculating replaced the sleep in his eyes instantly. "Under the mattress," he whispered. "Right side." Imani dropped to her knees, shoved her hand into the gap between mattress and box spring and found cold metal. A handgun, fully loaded, safety already off. "There's one in the chamber," Marcus murmured, hauling himself upright with his good arm. "Help me to the floor." "Behind the bed." "The chair's too exposed," Imani whispered back, already understanding, already moving. She grabbed his legs and helped ease him down, sliding him until his back was pressed against the solid wood of the footboard, hidden from the doorway. She pressed the gun into his hand. "Hide," he mouthed, jerking his chin toward the closet. Imani shook her head. She was not leaving him on the floor to face whatever was coming alone. She grabbed the heavy cane from the nightstand instead and crouched on the opposite side of the bed. The door handle turned slowly. Then with a splintering crack it was kicked open. 2 men stepped inside, tactical gear, night vision goggles pushed up onto their foreheads, moonlight catching the suppressors on their weapons. "Clear the bed," one of them whispered. They didn't wait to find out the bed was empty. Marcus fired first, twice from his position on the floor, the sound deafening in the enclosed room. The first man went down screaming, a round catching his knee, his weapon discharging wildly as he fell, tearing through the mattress inches from where Imani crouched. The second man pivoted, aiming down at the source of the muzzle flash. Imani didn't think. She swung the cane with everything she had, connecting with his wrist with a sickening crack that made him howl and drop his weapon. Marcus fired again and the second man went down and didn't move. The room reeked of gunpowder and scorched fabric and blood. "Imani." Marcus's voice was strained. "Are you hit?" "No." "Are you?" Before he could answer, slow, mocking applause echoed from the hallway. "Not bad, Marcus." Even from the floor. Deshawn stepped into the doorway. He wasn't wearing tactical gear. He wore a sharp suit and carried a revolver loose at his side. 3 more armed men fanned out behind him. "I figured it was you," Marcus said, remarkably steady for a man sitting in a wreckage of blood and shattered furniture. "I waited 6 months," Deshawn said. "Watched you run this family from a hospital bed. Watched you hide behind locked doors. And now look at you. Hiding behind the skirts of your nurse." His eyes cut to Imani with open contempt. "Should have taken the severance when he offered it, sweetheart." "I don't run from bullies," Imani said, her voice steadier than her hands. She pressed her shoulder against Marcus's, grounding herself in his warmth. "Especially not ones who need 3 armed men to feel brave." Deshawn raised the revolver, aiming it squarely at Marcus's chest. "Last words, boss." Marcus didn't look at the gun. He looked at Imani and something passed between them, silent, urgent, understood. Deshawn had stepped, without realizing it, directly in front of the reinforced wheelchair still parked beside the bed. Marcus's free hand, hidden from view, had never let go of his phone. He hit a single button on the screen. The 400-pound titanium chair surged forward with brutal, silent force, slamming into the back of Deshawn's knees hard enough to fold his legs the wrong way. He screamed, the revolver flying from his hand, clattering out of reach. Before his men in the hallway could process what had happened, Gunfire erupted from the corridor. Frankie and 3 loyal guards flooding in, tearing through what remained of the ambush in a brief, deafening final exchange. When it was over, Deshawn lay pinned beneath the wheelchair, sobbing, clutching his shattered legs. Marcus stared down at him from the floor, unharmed, breathing hard. "Strength was never in your legs, Deshawn," he said, cold and quiet. "It's in your mind. And yours was always weak." Frankie appeared in the doorway, face streaked with sweat and someone else's blood. "House is secure, boss. We got the rest at the gate." "Take him to the warehouse," Marcus ordered. "Get a doctor to set his legs. I want him conscious when I deal with this tomorrow." Frankie hauled Deshawn out by his collar and silence rushed back into the room, thick and ringing. Imani sat back against the bed frame, adrenaline draining out of her all at once, leaving her hollow and shaking. Marcus reached over and pulled her against his side, his arm around her shoulders, both of them sitting on the floor of a room that smelled like blood and gun smoke, and neither of them said anything for a long time. "You should be angry at me," Marcus finally said. "I told you this life doesn't leave room for people I love. This is exactly what I meant." "I'm not angry," Imani said, resting her head against his shoulder. "I'm still here. You could have died tonight. Because of me. I could die crossing the street tomorrow," she said. "I don't want a guarantee, Marcus. I want a choice. And I'm choosing this. I'm choosing you." He turned his head, pressing a kiss to her hair. And for the first time since the explosion that took his legs, Marcus Kane didn't feel like half a man sitting in the wreckage of what he used to be. He felt sitting on that floor with her entirely whole. The weeks that followed were not easy. Nothing about rebuilding a fractured organization ever is. But they were, for the first time in longer than Marcus could remember, hopeful. He began the slow, difficult work of moving parts of his empire into legitimate ventures, the way Imani had gently pushed him toward for weeks. Real estate holdings. Logistics companies with actual paperwork instead of shadows. It wouldn't happen overnight, and some nights the old world clawed back at him in ways that frightened them both. But the direction had changed, and that mattered. Zuri, for her part, adjusted to her strange new life the way only a small child can, completely without hesitation, declaring Marcus's study her office too, and insisting he attend her stuffed animal tea parties with the same gravity he once reserved for board meetings. Frankie became, without anyone officially deciding it, something like an uncle, sneaking her contraband cookies and letting her help him check the perimeter cameras. 6 months after the ambush, Marcus stood at his own front door for the first time since the bomb took his legs. Stood using the cane, sweat beading on his forehead from the effort, his jaw set with the particular stubbornness Imani had come to love more than she ever expected to love anything, and watched Zuri run circles around the front lawn while Imani laughed at something Frankie said. He thought about the man he used to be. Untouchable. Alone by design because alone felt safer than the alternative. He thought about the girl who had walked in 40 minutes late with a formula stain on her sleeve and told him flat out that fear was a luxury she couldn't afford anymore. He thought about the sentence she'd whispered in a dark hallway at 2 a.m, not meant for him to hear, the truest thing either of them had said in years. Marcus Kane had built an empire out of nothing but ruthlessness and blood. But it was a broke, exhausted 25-year-old single mother who had finally taught him what it meant to actually live inside the life he'd built instead of just surviving it. He crossed the lawn, slow and unsteady, refusing every instinct to turn back for the chair. Imani looked up and saw him coming, and her whole face changed, softened, opened in the way it only ever did for him now. "You're supposed to be resting," she said. "I got tired of watching from the window," Marcus said. He reached her, breathing hard, and pulled her into him despite the effort it cost his body to stay standing. "I wanted to be out here. With you." With her. Zuri crashed into both their legs a second later, arms wrapped around whatever part of them she could reach, and Marcus Kane, feared boss, cold-blooded survivor, a man who had spent 6 months believing he was only half a person, stood on his own 2 feet in the middle of his front lawn, surrounded by the family he never planned for and could no longer imagine living without, and felt for the first time since the bomb went off, entirely and completely whole. If this story moved you, remember this. The people who show up for you when you have nothing to offer them but the truth are the ones worth holding on to for the rest of your life. Share this with someone who needs to hear that today. And if Imani and Marcus's story stayed with you, let us know in the comments. Was it the whispered sentence in the hallway, or the moment he stood up for her on his own 2 feet? We'll see you in the next one.